Well, I guess for starters, Donald Trump, all the polling shows is at his least popular that he's ever been. He is, underwater on just about every measure you can look at, every poll you can look at, especially when it comes to some of the core issues that he ran on originally with the economy. And people really don't like his handling of the war in Iran. That said, what this shows is that his power among Republicans is as strong as ever, right? If you want to win in a Republican primary, the way to do it is not by distancing yourself from Donald Trump. There's been, some talk among Republican strategists about approaches to the general election this year in the midterms and how closely a candidate wants to associate themselves with Donald Trump. Those are all, I think, still legitimate questions for a general election. But what we see here is that if you want to win in a primary, you've got to be really close to Trump. That's still just the way to get ahead in the Republican Party.
But I'm wondering if that is short-sighted. I mean, we talked to the chair of the RNC about this last weekend. Was it last weekend? It's been a long week. I think it was just last weekend.
Last week.
And we asked the same question. We had, the poll numbers show that the president's policies on Iran, on the economy, and Republicans' confidence, even in other Republicans on the economy, is really waning. And we said, is the tactic to distance yourself from those numbers? And he said, no, we are going to run fully into the Trump agenda. We believe this is the best administration in history. That may work in a primary, but is this going to hurt them? And are these sound bites going to get played again and again when these folks try to win a general?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really open question. Obviously in Louisiana, that's a very red state. It's not going to hurt a candidate to be close to Donald Trump. But when we start talking about some of those swing districts and that we're going to see in the midterm, some of the swing states and the swing districts, then we'll really see that question put to the test. And if history is any guide, associating yourself very closely with an unpopular president who many Americans view as failing on the key issues, I don't think that's a winning strategy. So, again, this is the conflict for Republicans. How close do I have to get to Donald Trump in the primary, and then can I backtrack in the general? We're going to have to see with some of these candidates. There have only been a few candidates still left in office who voted to impeach Donald Trump and are still around if you're a Republican. One of them coming up is Susan Collins in Maine, who will have a competitive general election race. And she's always kept Trump at arm's length. That's worked for her in her state of Maine. But we're going to see whether or not that brand can still exist in 2026.
Susan Collins is concerned. I know, Luke, I know you covered the Hill. This is the phrase. Definitely. Susan Collins is concerned, yeah.
Luke, gaze into your crystal ball and tell me what you see in terms of how you think Senator Cassidy's going to comport himself in the months ahead. I'm thinking of the way that Senator Thom Tillis has been kind of emboldened, speaking out more forcefully against the president and aspects of the president's agenda as he approaches his elective retirement from the Senate. Should we expect the same kind of behavior from Senator Cassidy in light of what you heard there at the top, the quotes that we played from him speaking at that concession event last night?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I think Cassidy's been constrained somewhat by having to pretend to be so close to Trump to try to stay in office. I think, he's one of these more old school Republicans from sort of the Mitt Romney strain of the party, from the George W. Bush strain of the party, where they really actually don't like Donald Trump. They don't like what he stands for. They have to pretend they do because that's what the Republican base voters want. I remember I was in the Capitol that day when Bill Cassidy voted to impeach Donald Trump. There was a widespread sentiment among Republicans at the time that what had happened on January 6th was wrong and that Donald Trump bore a lot of responsibility for the events of that day. And I remember we were in a little scrum and asked him about it, and he said, I voted to convict Donald Trump because he's guilty. Like that's just what the facts say. So there wasn't really a political consideration for him in that moment. And so I could expect similar bluntness from him in the coming months, now that he doesn't have to put on this act that he, is so close to Trump and loves Trump so much. I think he'll be free from that, and we could hear him talk, I think, more bluntly on a lot of issues.
All right, Luke, hang with us, because I know you also covered this recent trip to China of the president, but we want to bring in Jen Judson. She's our Bloomberg News defense reporter based out of D.C. Jen, we're going to kick it over to you because, Trump is back from this Asia trip, and the big thing that is the outlier now is whether or not he's going to approve this Taiwan arms deal. This was a big focus. We've got the president talking about it. We're going to play it for you. I think.
We're not looking to have wars, and if you kept it the way it is, I think China's going to be okay with that. But we're not looking to have somebody say, let's go independent because the United States is backing us.
So President Xi probably liked that you haven't approved the weapons to Taiwan.
I would say like is maybe too strong a word, because he thinks I could do it with just the signing of my signature, unlike Biden, who couldn't sign his signature. No, I'm holding that in abeyance, and it depends on China. It depends. It's a very good negotiating chip for us, frankly.
So obviously that's the president sitting down with Fox News' Brett Baier, using that Taiwan arms package as a negotiating chip. Jen, what's your take on that? And does that play into China's hands trying to get more control, or at least more apathy from the U.S. when it comes to the issue on Taiwan?
Yeah, I think that this really shows unclear intentions, from Donald Trump here for a major pending Taiwan arms package. Just a little bit of background. The admin already approved a major package for Taiwan that's worth roughly $11 billion. That delivery could slow. But there's another proposed package that's reportedly around $14 billion that now appears politically sensitive, after Xi Jinping warned Trump that support to Taiwan in this way could lead to clashes and conflict. So we're not getting a lot of clarity on the direction that Trump may go with this arms deal.
Pick up on this, if you would, Luke. I'm curious the degree to which you felt this kind of animating or weaving through the conversations that were happening over the course of that trip. I think Christina and I were both surprised after there was that initial readout from that meeting with President Xi, in which we learned he spoke quite forcefully about the Taiwan issue.
Then they came in the middle of the meeting.
In the middle of the meeting, and took some time before we saw a U.S. response. Pull back, if you would, Luke, and just put that into some broader context. The way that the way in which the president is talking about Taiwan is radically different than we've seen presidents talk about it in the past, as has historically been the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I just got back from Beijing, so apologies if I'm a little jet lagged. But look, each of these men came into their meeting with a specific goal. Xi was extremely focused on Taiwan. It was essentially the first thing that came out of their mouths when the Chinese put out a readout after the private meeting. They basically said, if you guys drop the Taiwan issue, if you stop supporting them, then we can be friends. And if you don't, we are destined for a conflict. And it almost sounded like a military conflict, the way they were talking about it. Trump came into the meeting all about business deals. He brought 14 to 18 of America's business executives with him. All he talked about was friendship and deals and trying to make money. And so you have two people with extremely different strategies. Trump, in all of his comments afterwards, didn't care much about Taiwan. He talked about how far away it is from us, and it's not really on the agenda of the American people. But this was the focus for China. And so it does sound like, based on Donald Trump's rhetoric after this meeting, that President Xi of China really got through to him, and that he is breaking with the traditional American foreign policy of decades, which is to support this little democracy right by China against an autocracy. So it seemed that Donald Trump was impressed with President Xi, liked what he said about Taiwan, and is now having second thoughts about America's support.
Jen, I want to pick up on something that Luke mentioned, which was going to be my next question anyway, which is President Trump focusing on the fact that it's thousands of miles away and just seems really apathetic of even the idea of engaging this conflict. This comes after we've got the USS Ford returning after 11 months deployment. They did the Maduro raid, they did the Mideast. There's rumors and rumblings that Trump is now setting his sights on Cuba. What is the military's bandwidth and operational capacity to even get engaged in a conflict in Taiwan at this point, if that were even something the president wanted to do, which that's very much up in the air?
I think that's the big question, and I think in terms of handling the arms packages, what that signals about the U.S. commitment to deterrence in the U.S. and the Indo-Pacific region for the U.S. It really calls into question that, I think one of the things China is watching when it comes to, say, the U.S.'s involvement in the Middle East right now. I would imagine that from Beijing's perspective, every U.S. carrier group tied down in the Gulf is one less source of pressure near Taiwan. Ford came back from an 11-month deployment. That is the most advanced U.S. aircraft carrier that we have. It needs some time in port. It had a fire on board. It had plumbing issues that, kind of calls into question some of the readiness of how long can these carriers really be deployed. And this one was in 2 different theaters. It was in the Caribbean as well as in the Gulf. So a very active deployment. I would say that if you talk to the U.S. military right now, they would say that they are absolutely positioned and aligned to deal with China and the Indo-Pacific at the moment. But of course, this came up quite a bit on Capitol Hill during hearings where the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and General Kane testified about munition stockpiles.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions from lawmakers about whether they could manage all of the various activities, wars in Iran, as well as position in the Indo-Pacific based on how we're expending munitions in this current war.